Hello everyone. With the elections to the 18th Lok Sabha just on the horizon and going to be held in 7 phases in April, May and June of 2024, much of the discussion in the public domain on the Indian economy is very polarized. There are those who support the government and argue that the Indian economy has been significantly transformed over the last 10 years. There are others who argue that a number of blunderous decisions were taken in the last 10 years and the economy is doing very badly in the last decade compared to the previous decade. What do official numbers tell us? In this presentation, we shall try to analyze the official numbers and reconcile between the tall claims of the government and the reality felt by the people on the ground. We shall try to structure our presentation in the following form today. To begin with, we shall try to understand the debate over the size of the Indian economy. How big is India's GDP relative to other important economies of the world? The second point that we shall consider is related to how different sectors of the economy are performing. How is the overall economic growth? And within that, what is the nature of agricultural growth? What is the nature of industrial growth, and so on. The third important factor that we will discuss is related to the important indicators of economic growth or transformation in India. For example, we shall consider the investment rate, savings rate, exports, credit supplied by banks, and so on. From there, we will move on to discuss some of the important indicators of people's well-being. What is the record of the Indian economy in generating adequate number of jobs for its young people? What is the record of the Indian economy in reducing poverty? And we shall conclude by asking a few questions about the tall claims made by the government, as we discussed earlier, and how they can be reconciled, if at all they can be, with the realities on the ground as felt by people. Let's begin with the first point. How big is the Indian economy? What is the size of India's GDP relative to other important or major economies of the world? Now, India's Prime Minister, when he was speaking at the US Congress in the month of July of 2023, made a very interesting statement. He told them, when I first visited the US as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest and we will be the 3rd largest very soon. Now, this claim of the Prime Minister of India essentially follows from a projection made by international organizations, particularly the International Monetary Fund or the IMF, which essentially said that India's size of GDP will cross the $5 trillion mark by the year 27-28. And by that time, India in terms of the size of its GDP would have surpassed the GDP size of Germany and Japan and become the 3rd largest economy of the world, only behind the United States and China, which occupy the first and second ranks. So India will become the 3rd largest economy behind United States and China by 2027-28. This is the claim. But there is an additional claim. That additional claim is that by the year 2047 or 2050, India will become a high-income developed economy. There is also the following claim that in about 5 or 10 years from now, India will completely eliminate all forms of poverty. And this elimination of poverty will follow from the rapid growth of GDP that India will have over the next 5 or 10 years also. So these are the claims that we have. Now, how do you assess them? Now, comparable data on the size of GDP are available both from the World Bank and from what are called the Penn World Tables. These are all purchasing power parity adjusted data. Now, one important factor that we must remember when we compare the sizes of GDP across countries is that we have to compare purchasing power parity adjusted GDP at constant prices, or real GDP is what we must compare when we compare India's GDP with Germany's GDP or Japan's GDP. But there is an additional factor here, which is that countries have different populations. So we need to normalize the size of our GDP with some indicator which accounts for the different population sizes in different countries. So a very useful and very simple indicator to use is the per capita GDP. We divide the size of the GDP with our population and we will get a figure of the per capita GDP or the GDP commanded by one person or one citizen of India. Now, what do data tell us? Interestingly, the government's claim that we are currently the 5th largest economy in the world and we will become the 3rd largest economy in the world soon is based on GDP sizes estimated at current prices. Now that gives you a very problematic assessment of India's size. India's claim is essentially made based on GDP sizes at current prices. That's when India is the 5th largest economy in the world today and we will become the 3rd largest economy in 2027-28. But if you take the appropriate method or the most reasonable or robust method of comparison, which is GDP estimated at constant prices, we will see a very startling fact. And that startling fact is that India has already become the 3rd largest economy in the world. India has been the 3rd largest economy in the world from 2011 itself, according to World Bank data. Interesting, because for the last 12 or 13 years, we have been enjoying the position of the 3rd largest economy in the world. Now, this is a very interesting fact because nobody in the newspapers, nobody in the media, I have seen pointing out this important problem. When appropriately measured, we are already the 3rd largest economy in the world and we are unlikely to improve our rank. That is, we are unlikely to take our GDP size ahead of either China's or United States any time in the next 100 years. Now, this is one very important fact that we need to remember. India is already the 3rd largest economy in the world. Its rank is not going to improve from the present 3rd rank in 27-28. In fact, it is unlikely to change in the next 50 to 100 years. Now, let us take the second important indicator. The second important indicator that we are considering is the per capita GDP. Now, what happens if you consider the rank of India in terms of per capita GDP? Here it turns out India's rank among all countries of the world is 127th in terms of per capita income. Now, that's a very bad record. That's a very bad record for many reasons, not just because it is small in absolute terms, but also because in South Asia, you have 3 other countries which have higher per capita incomes compared to India. Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan are 3 countries in South Asia which have higher per capita incomes than India at an absolute level. So essentially, our record in raising per capita incomes of our population is very, very poor. Now, what is going to happen in 2047 or 2050? Estimates that I have seen coming from the Niti Aayog under the government of India essentially tell you that our rank in the world in terms of per capita GDP is likely to improve from the present 127th to about 90th by 2047 or 2050. In other words, when we are claiming that we would become a high income developed country by 2047 or 2050, we will have 89 countries ahead of us in terms of per capita GDP. Now, is that a robust claim? Is that a reasonable situation to be in? You are the 3rd largest economy in the world, but you are 90th in terms of per capita GDP, and yet you call yourself a high income developed country? Or is it purely a matter of political propaganda rather than statistical robustness at hand? This is a very important problem that we need to ponder about. I will end this part with one more important data point, which is that the estimates of the Niti Aayog also show that by 2047 or 2050, our per capita GDP is only likely to be 66% of the per capita GDP of China at the same time. In other words, if China's per capita GDP is 100 in 2047 or 2050, India's per capita GDP is likely to be just about 66 or so. Now, this is another important feature that we need to consider. We are unlikely to go ahead of China anytime in the near future with respect to overall size of the GDP. And when we claim to be a high income developed country, that is in 2047 or 2050, our per capita GDP will still be only 66% of what it would be for China. So we need to consider the tall claims of the government with respect to the size of the economy, our rank in the world in terms of the size of the GDP and so on, with not just a pinch of salt, maybe with a bucket of salt. Let us now come to some figures on how the economy has been performing over the last decade. Now, let us first look at quarterly rates of growth of GDP in the Indian economy. The numbers that you will currently see on the screen are year-on-year growth rates of the gross value added in the economy at basic prices. You see two lines with two colors because the black line pertains to the base year of 2004-05 and the green line pertains to the new base year of 2011-12. What do you see in this graph? This graph essentially tells you that there has been no real pickup in the growth rates of the Indian economy after 2011-12. Look closely at the numbers. Between 2011-12 and about 16-17, you have a certain flatness in the growth rate of the economy. There is neither an increase nor a decrease that you will see, which is statistically notable in any form. But look at that graph closely from the third quarter of 2016-17 onwards, which is the quarter in which India implemented the disastrous demonetization. We followed it the next year with a very unplanned GST reform process. And these two shocks to the Indian economy were such that the growth rates of GDP or GVA that you see in the graph in front of you begin to fall from about 2016-17 right up to the beginning of COVID, that is the third or fourth quarter of 2019-20. So in short, the slowing down of the Indian economy, as you can see from this graph, has begun from 2016-17 onwards, and it had to do with the twin shocks to the economy, first in 2016-17 in the form of demonetization, and then in 2017-18 in the form of an unplanned GST reform rollout. Now, this is the first point that we have to note. Further on from 2019-20, of course, you see a sharp dip, which is the COVID period, which is followed by an uptick, which is essentially a recovery and nothing else. And then you see the GDP growth rates falling back to the original levels that you had over the last decade or so. So there is no acceleration that we see in GDP growth rates over the last decade, or even a little ahead of that as well. If you consider the last 15 years, there is no real pickup of the GDP growth rates that you see in the economy. Now, this is well in line with some projections that we have of how the Indian economy will be performing in the next year. You have projections coming out from the International Monetary Fund. You have projections coming out from UNCTAD. All of them show that the annual growth rate of the Indian economy next year is unlikely to exceed 7% per year. They are going to be either 6.6 or 6.8%, which essentially shows or means that we are back to the levels that existed in the last decade, in most quarters of the last decade, and the uptick that you see in the post-COVID period, which was essentially a recovery from a sharp dip, is just a short-lived one, and we are back to the normal now. which is the first point that we would like to see. Now look at this table that we have. This table essentially gives you growth rates of the Indian economy. Now here we are comparing growth rates between 2003-04 to 2010-11, and then we are looking at 2011-12 to about 2019-20. Now this essentially means that we are discounting for the COVID years, and we are essentially trying to see what happened till COVID hit the Indian economy. You will see that between 2011-12 and 2019-20, the GVA at basic prices grew only by about 6.7% per year, which was lower than the growth rate that we had between 2003-04 and 10-11, which was about 7%. How do different sectors do? In agriculture, in manufacturing and industry, and in services. In all three sectors of the economy, we see that according to this periodization that we have on the screen, a fall of growth rates between the first period, that is 2003-04 to 2010-11, and then 2011-12 to 2019-20. Agricultural growth rates fall, industrial growth rates fall, and services growth rates also fall. So across the board, there is a fall of growth rates. Now let us look at this table. Now this table essentially tells you that if we go out of the periodization that we attempted in the last table and look at a new kind of periodization, which is 2004-05 to 2013-14, and then 2014-15 to first 2019-20 till COVID began, and then between 2014-15 and 2022-23, which is the full 9 years of the present government. Now, what do these numbers tell us? These numbers again tell you that however you look at it, whether you compare the 2004-05 to 2013-14 numbers with either 2014-15 to 2019-20 period or 2014-15 to 2022-23 period, in both cases, the overall growth rates of GVA at basic prices is essentially lower in the latter periods compared to the period between 2004-05 and 2013-14. Now, in the COVID period, you had some better performance of agriculture thanks to better rainfall that we had, some good exports that we had of agricultural commodities and so on. So we had some good growth rates coming out from agriculture. But outside agriculture, in both industry and services, we have a very bad fall of growth rates, both when we consider 2014-15 to 2019-20 or when we consider 2014-15 to 2022-23. You see the growth rates in industry falling from about 6.84% to either 5.6% or 4.67%, and the growth rate in services falling from 7.54% to either 7.47% or 4.67%. So however you look at it, except the one bright spot that you see in agricultural growth rates during the COVID years, our economy has been performing very badly over the last 9 or 10 years compared to the decade prior to that. That is the clear conclusion that we have from the tables that we are currently seeing in front of us. Now, if you actually consider that our GDP was 100 in 2019-20, where are we now? How much have we recovered from the pandemic? Are we, as the government claims that we are the fastest growing economy of the world and so on, how much have we really recovered from the levels of GDP that we had in 2019-20? Turns out very little. Applying actual growth rates of the economy to that 100 normalized figure of 100 in 2019-20, we are today at 118. In other words, we have a growth rate of 18% over 4 years, which you average it on a per year basis comes to just about 4% per year. So in the last 4 years, our economy has grown just by about 4%. That is the reality of growth and attendant indicators. For example, this will essentially mean or essentially indicate how much employment we have generated in the economy, how much poverty we have been able to reduce, and so on, are essentially dependent on this number in a big way. So if we consider that we have grown at only about 4% in the last 4 years, which essentially shows that very little per capita GDP increase has happened in India in the last 4 years, we can understand how bad the situation of livelihood would have been for the people of India on the ground. This is one important point that we have to remember when we consider or discuss growth rates of the Indian economy in the last few years. Now let us come to the question of how different sectors of the economy have been performing in the last 10 years. Now we have already discussed the case of agriculture, and we said that agricultural growth rates were lower if we consider the period only up to 2019-20, but they are a tad higher if we consider the COVID years also and consider the period from 2014-15 up to 2022-23. But what is more distressing is the fact there is a crisis of livelihoods in agriculture which has been unrelenting and which has been with us for a long period of time. There is a crisis of incomes in agriculture. On the one side, the government of India made the startling claim that it would double the real incomes of farmers between 2015 and 2022. Curiously, that claim has completely disappeared, both from the discourse of the spokespersons of the government and from discourses in the so-called independent media that we have. What is the reality in agriculture? Now, let us look at one simple graph to understand this better. This is the graph that shows the sectoral deflator in agriculture. What is the sectoral deflator in agriculture? I calculate two types of annual growth rates. I calculate the growth rates of agricultural GDP at current prices and the growth rates of agricultural GDP at constant prices. Now, if I deduct the second from the first, I get a difference, which is what I call as a sectoral deflator. And if this difference is actually expanding or increasing, it essentially shows that current prices are rising faster than constant prices, and that's a good thing for farmers. They get better prices. But if the current prices are not rising fast at all, and the difference between the growth rate at current prices and the growth rate at constant prices is actually shortening or narrowing down over the years, then it essentially shows that prices are not rising at all. Now, what you see in agriculture is that between the period between about 2011, between about 2001 and about 2010-11, we see that there is a rise in the sectoral deflator in the economy, which essentially shows that agricultural prices were rising in India during that period. But look at the period after about 2010-11, what has happened afterwards till the present year that we have on the graph. The numbers very clearly show that the sectoral deflator in agriculture has been on a regular fall for the last 10 or even 12 to 13 years. Now, this essentially shows that farmers are getting prices for their products which are simply not rising at all compared to either the costs of living that they might have or the costs of inputs that they may have to purchase from the market. Prices are simply not rising in agriculture for farmers. This is one important facet of the crisis in agriculture that we completely miss if we simply look at GDP growth rates. This graph essentially tells us that incomes of farmers are simply not rising. As a result of which, what is happening? Farmers are increasingly reluctant to invest in agriculture. Now, this graph in front of you essentially shows what are the levels of public and private investment in agriculture, in capital formation, as a share of agricultural GDP. What comes out as startling in this figure is that private investment in agriculture as a share of agricultural GDP has been consistently falling over the last decade. This is very important because capital formation in agriculture determines how much production and productivity we will have increasingly from agriculture. Now this is falling, which essentially shows that there is a serious problem of disincentive in agriculture to invest in agriculture. Public investment, on the other hand, has been stagnant. It has not been rising at all, as the orange line at the bottom will essentially tell you. This is the first indicator that I want to put in front of you. But the government can actually do something about it. It can ameliorate the distress, which is essentially marked by falling agricultural prices or agricultural prices that are not rising adequately at all. It can ameliorate this problem by increasing the one tool that it has in its hand, which is the minimum support price. Now, there is a large farmers' agitation today going on to make the MSP legal across India, to increase the MSP to at least the cost of production, which is C2 plus 50%. That debate is going on. But what has the government actually done in this area in the last 10 years? This graph essentially tells you that minimum support prices have grown at a much slower rate in the last 10 years compared to the 10 years prior to it. If on an average, minimum support prices were increasing by about 8% every year between 2003-04 and 2012-13, between 2013-14 and 2023-24, minimum support prices have on an average risen by only about 5% per year. Now this essentially shows that MSPs are also not rising at all, and whatever benefits the farmers could obtain from a higher MSP is being denied to them. Now what does this mean for the profitability in cultivation? On the one hand, you have costs of inputs that are rising rapidly. Fertilizers today cost at least 3 to 5 times more than what they used to cost 20 years back. Now that essentially means this rise in prices of outputs has to be commensurate with the rise in cost of inputs. If that does not happen, profitability will fall and the farmer will increasingly move towards a loss-making situation in agriculture. Now this graph essentially shows for paddy, for wheat, you will see that profitability ratios are falling very sharply in Indian agriculture. Profitability rates are calculated here by dividing the gross value of output with the cost of cultivation. Now there are two lines that you will see in this graph. The top one is when you divide it by the A2 cost of production, and the bottom one is if you consider the C2 cost of production as the denominator. In both cases, there is a fall of profitability. But what is interesting is that if you consider the C2 cost of production and see what is the profitability ratio if you consider C2 cost of production as the denominator, in most years agriculture is actually loss-making for the Indian farmer. This is clearly visible here for paddy and wheat. It is only when you do not consider the opportunity costs of land and labor in agriculture that agriculture actually can be considered as fairly profitable. If you consider those imputed costs of land and labor, agriculture is loss-making in most years and is just about profitable in most of the other years. That is the situation that we have. So profitability ratios are falling in paddy, in wheat. Now I will take you to the profitability ratios for maize and cotton in this particular graph. Here again, you are going to see a fall of profitability ratios. So agriculture is increasingly less profitable for the Indian farmer, and that is something that is consciously policy-induced a crisis. Now let us see what is happening to agricultural incomes. What is striking is that this table, which is based on official data from the Situation Assessment Survey of the National Sample Survey Organization, essentially shows that incomes of agricultural households, real incomes of agricultural households from cultivation have actually fallen between 2012-13 and 2018-19 by about 1.4%. In other words, there is an absolute decline of real incomes from cultivation for agricultural households in India between 2012-13 and till 2018-19. This may be the reason why the government is no more talking about doubling farmers' incomes. You in fact do not have doubling of farmers' incomes. You actually have a fall of farmers' incomes in this period. Let us move on to the other sector that we have, which is industry. This graph in front of you essentially shows the growth rates of the index of industrial production in Indian industrial sector. What do these bars tell us? These bars essentially tell us that you had very high levels of industrial growth till about 2007-8, and after about 2007-8 you never had any year where your industrial growth rates were anywhere near respectable as compared to the period prior to that. That is one important feature that we see. In fact, in 2019-20 and 2020-21, you had negative growth rates of industrial production in India. So industry is also not doing well at all in addition to agriculture. This is something that becomes very clear when we look at these numbers. In fact, what is the level of confidence in the Indian economy in the eyes of international investors? These numbers that you see in the graph in front of you essentially tells you how much was the net FDI flows into India over the last 10 or 12 years. This graph essentially tells you that there has been no real increase in the net FDI flows into India in the last 8 to 10 years. In other words, the level of confidence that the international investors have in the Indian economy has not increased at all in the period of the present government. This is again something that is contrary to the tall claims made by the government that the stature of the Indian economy has significantly improved in the eyes of the international investors in the last 5 or 10 years. That does not appear to be true if you look at the nature of FDI flows into the Indian economy at all. So in all sectors that we see, agriculture and industry, which are the two productive sectors in the economy, we are doing very badly over the last 10 years. That is the reality on the ground. Now let us come to some of the indicators that are associated with economic growth. Now these are the indicators that generally improve when economic growth also improves. The first indicator that I would like to present before you is investment rate. In other words, how much is the gross capital formation in the economy as a share of our GDP in each year. Now, if you ask me what would be the most important graph related to Indian economy that you would like to show your students or an audience, I would choose this particular graph. This essentially shows a precipitous fall of investment rates in the Indian economy from about 2011 onwards. And it also shows that the present government has been able to do absolutely nothing to revive it in the last 10 years. Our investment rates have fallen from close to about 39.8% in 2010-11 to about 32.2% in the year 2022-23. This means that the incentives of investors to invest in the Indian economy has sharply declined in the last 10 or even 13 years. How much is this fall amounting to in terms of lost investment? Suppose I assume that our investment rate was constant at 39.8% for across the last decade after 2011-12, then that would mean that India could have additionally invested close to rupees 97 lakh crores in the last 10 or 12 years, but we had to forego that investment because the investment rate fell. Now, somebody may tell me that, look, 39.8% is a very high investment rate and it would be impossible to maintain it over a long period. Fair enough. Let me reduce it and keep it at an average level of about 36%. If I keep it at 36%, it turns out that even then, there is an enormous amount of investment that we could have made in the economy, but we could not do. Close to rupees 47 lakh crore could have been invested in the economy if we had maintained the investment rate at 36% over the last decade, but we could not do that. This has very important impacts on how much was the job generation in the economy in the past decade, how much was poverty reduction in the last decade, how much was the relative well-being of the population of India over the last decade. All of that were in some form or the other fundamentally dependent on how much we are investing in the economy. Now that is one important flip side of the rosy picture of the economy that is often painted by the spokespersons of the government or the mainstream media. Now this also spills over into other areas. Why is investment rate falling in India? Why did the investment rate fall so rapidly in India over the last decade? Most economists view this as a serious problem of incentives to invest. Now, this incentive to invest in the economy is dependent on how much demand is there in the economy. In other words, companies or firms decide to invest in the economy based on a certain projection of what will be the extent of demand for what they produce. If the projected demand is actually lower or depressed or compressed, then the incentives to invest afresh in the economy would be lower. And that appears to be one big problem that we've had. Of course, the government will tell you we had a twin balance sheet problem and so on. But beyond all that, we had a problem of a fall of aggregate demand, which seriously dented the incentives to invest in the economy. Now, this graph essentially tells you what is the capacity utilization in manufacturing in India. Now, what do the numbers tell you? These numbers essentially tell you that our capacity utilization in manufacturing was close to 82 to 83% sometime in 2010 or 2011. But from then onwards, we have had a fall of capacity utilization in manufacturing, on an average, of course, because there have been some years or quarters where it has performed better, but on the whole, you never had that kind of capacity utilization in manufacturing ever after 2011-12. Even today, our capacity utilization stands at about 73 or 74% only, which is far lower than what we had in the past. And this also has to be seen along with the line, the black line that you see in the graph, which essentially gives you an inventory to sales ratio. This essentially tells you that our inventories have been rising relative to sales in manufacturing over a much larger part of the last 10 years that we are discussing today. Now, this essentially means that because demand has been lower in the economy, inventories have probably been piling up. Now, that is not a good sign for industry at all. Now, let us move on to another indicator that I want to present before you. This might be startling to some, but this is the reality that we see. These are profit rates in Indian private, corporate, non-financial sector. Now, these numbers, the typical ratio that we consider is profit after tax as a share of gross fixed assets of companies. These are taken from the database called Prof, which is put out by the private agency Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. These numbers show that we have had a very sharp fall of profit rates in the private, corporate, non-financial sector for much of the last decade. If the economy was performing so well, should this ratio not have been rising or at least be constant? No, it has actually been falling. And this is one important reason why private companies have not been investing in the economy at all. And that has been seriously affecting the generation of employment or the reduction of poverty in the economy. Now, you see one more startling but vulgar phenomenon in this particular graph, which is that in the last 2 or 3 years, you actually see a rise of profit rates of the private, corporate, non-financial sector. Now, interestingly, this is also the period when COVID had struck the economy. And about 85 to 90% of people had seen lower incomes at an absolute level compared to the period prior to COVID. So when we had about 80 to 85 to 90% of people experiencing fall of incomes, on the other hand, you have been seeing a rise of profit rates in the corporate sector. This has been achieved primarily through reducing the workforce, and that is something that has affected employment generation on the one hand, but it is also the result of another important development. In 2019, the government of India reduced the corporate tax rates substantially from 30% to about 22% on an average. My estimates tell me that on an average, the amount of corporate tax revenue lost to the government of India every year because of this tax cut is close to rupees 1.5 lakh crores. Now, leave that aside. In other words, this is the amount that the corporate sector implicitly obtained for themselves as a consequence of the fall of corporate tax rate. Now, they could have invested this in the economy and generated more jobs. That was the whole purpose or objective of that corporate tax reduction, even though it was implemented despite a lot of opposition or criticism from a lot of economists. But the government went ahead and did it to please the corporate sector. And this was done to ensure that they would increase investments in the economy. But the numbers actually tell us, as we saw in the previous slides, that investment rates have not been rising. Companies have actually been using this implicit revenue to them to either repay old debts or to fatten their kitties, in other words, to increase their profit rates. This is the vulgarity that is unraveling in the Indian economy today. Fall of incomes for the majority, but a rise in profit rates for the corporate sector. Now, you can judge for yourself how vulgar this is or whether this is good at all for the economy or for the society. Now, let us see one more feature here. This essentially shows the savings rate in the Indian economy. How much are people saving in India as a share of India's GDP? In fact, this graph essentially takes the gross national disposable income as the denominator. That is how savings rate is usually estimated and presented. Here again, you see that savings rate in the economy has been falling from about 36.2% in 2010-11 to about 29.7% in 2022-23. So alongside investment rates, there has also been a fall of savings rates in the economy, which is actually also an indicator of how much people are saving and how much they are putting it in different institutions of savings in the economy. Again, a bad sign for how the economy is doing. Let us take two more indicators which are fundamental to the health of the economy. The first is how much do we export as a share of our GDP. This graph actually tells us, the orange line that you will see will tell you that our exports to GDP ratio was close to 17% in 2013-14. But from there onwards, we have had a regular fall of the exports to GDP ratio, except in the last 2 years. even after the rise in the last 2 years, we are still substantially lower than the 17% ratio that we had in 2013-14. In other words, exports have been doing badly. We've got schemes like Make in India and so on, but these data essentially tell you that our exports to GDP ratio has not been improving at all. We will also see one more graph as part of this. This is the growth of bank credit from banks in India to the public. This is also something that is an indicator of whether people are borrowing enough from the banks to invest in the economy. Now, these numbers also show a precipitous fall over the last decade, or sometimes even more than a decade. From about 2011, 12, 13, we have had a fall of growth rates of monthly disbursements of bank credit compared to the same period previous year. And there has been some improvement in the more recent years, but that improvement in the more recent years has been hardly sufficient to compensate in any adequate form for the very sharp fall of bank credit disbursement that we have had over the past decade. This is also a sign which tells us that people are not borrowing enough from banks to invest in the economy. I will give you two small anecdotes with this. The Finance Minister of India, Nirmala Sitharaman, had gone to an industrialist meet about 2 years back, and she had lamented that I have done so much for you. I have cut the corporate tax rates for you. I have done this, I have done that, but you are not investing in the economy at all. Why? She was sort of scolding them, so to say, in that forum and asking them to invest, or exhorting them to invest in the economy. But they were quiet because they knew that there was very little demand in the economy. There was very little incentive for them to invest in the economy. The second important point or anecdote that I would like to bring to your notice is a public statement by the former chairperson of the State Bank of India. In one newspaper report that we have all seen, she was lamenting that I am sitting at a liquidity, or sitting over a liquidity of about rupees 2 lakh crore today, and nobody is coming to me to borrow this money from me. And that again showed signs of absence of incentive to invest in the economy, which in turn is related to the extent of demand for investment that exists in the economy. So look at all these indicators that we have seen: investment rate, savings rate, exports to GDP ratio, bank credit, capacity utilization in manufacturing. All these numbers essentially tell you that the economy has been doing very, very badly, and that has nothing to do with the COVID pandemic of the last 3 or 4 years. Even prior to that, Indian economy has been doing very, very badly. From different indicators of the economy and how economic growth has been in the last decade or so, let us now come to some of the indicators of well-being of people in India. And the first indicator that we will try to consider is that of employment generation in the economy. Now, to begin with itself, we have to mention that there has always been, in the last few years, certainly the last decade, a crisis in the availability of data to analyze employment adequately. The last employment and unemployment survey that we had was in 2011-12. After that, we had something called the periodic labor force survey beginning from 2017-18. But for a long period of time, the government was not releasing the report of the periodic labor force survey of 2017-18 because that showed a rise of unemployment in India. But then after 2017-18, you had a small fall of unemployment rates, which then meant that the same report, which was unacceptable to the spokespersons of the government in 2017-18, suddenly became acceptable to them. Now they cite periodic labor force surveys to argue that the labor force participation has risen sharply in India, and the unemployment rates have fallen in India in the last 5, 6 or 7 years. Now this is something that we shall try to examine in this segment. Now before we begin discussing these numbers, we will need to discuss a little bit about what is the context behind discussing employment data in India. The first is that of the demographic dividend. Now demographic dividend, you must have heard that term in multiple forums. It essentially tells you of a certain period in the history of countries where, due to certain reasons of demographic change, you have a more than 50% share in the share of people who are in the working age groups. So let us take 15 to 59 years, sometimes it is taken as 15 to 64 years also. What is the share of this age group in the population? At some point, because of falls of death rate, birth rate, etc., you will have a situation where the middle in the population pyramid will bulge, which essentially means that there is a more than 50% share in the working age category of people in the population. That's a good thing because you have more people to work. More people to work essentially means more production can be generated from the economy. Now this does not go on forever. It goes on for some time. In the Indian case, it is estimated that it will go up to about 65% or 66% at some point in the future. And from that point onwards, because birth rate and fertility rates have been falling, the share of working age groups will start falling back from 66 or 65% backwards. And finally, it will dip below 50% after a particular point. At that point, the window of demographic dividend is closed. So the more recent consensus that we have in among scholars of development economics is that every country, including India, have about 35, 37 or sometimes even 40 years. That is a space or stretch of that window that we have of demographic dividend when we have a large number of people to work and employ. If you are able to devise policies to use these workers productively, then you can achieve very high levels of demographic, not just very high levels of economic growth during this period. Now that is something that you have to grab, because this is just a window you have for a short period of time. In the Indian case, what we see is that this window will start shrinking from about 2041, and it is likely to completely close by about 2055, which essentially means that you have to devise policies to utilize this workforce and increase your production substantially and increase your growth of per capita income also substantially during this period, because after that your dependency ratios will start to rise. You have more people to take care of in the elderly age groups because your life expectancy also will be rising, and you have less number of people to work, so you will be able to produce less, but you will have to take care of more people outside the working age groups. Now this is the challenge that we have. This is why it is argued that India must very sharply increase employment inside the economy. But what is the reality that figures tell us, official data tell us? Now let us examine a table which shows us numbers related to labor force participation rates and also unemployment rates in the economy. What do these numbers essentially tell you? These numbers tell you that between 2011-12 and 2017-18, there was a very clear fall of labor force participation rate in the economy, which was associated with a rise of unemployment rates, a rather sharp rise of unemployment rates from about 2.2% in 2011-12 to 6.1% in 2017-18. Now, this 6.1% unemployment is something that has been often cited in the literature as the highest unemployment rate in India in the last 45 years. Now, this is one striking feature of change till about 2017-18, which probably was an immediate result of demonetization, GST reform, etc., which saw a large number of jobs being lost, a large number of informal jobs being lost and they being transformed into formal sector jobs and so on. So this might be one of the reasons, apart from the longer term fall of investment rates in the economy. So this was certainly a very bad phase for the economy in terms of employment generation. From 2017 onwards, admittedly, you have a rise, slow rise of labor force participation rate and a slow fall in the unemployment rates in the economy. And if you see the data for 22-23, which is in the last row, you will see that our labor force participation rates have now become about 42.4% and unemployment rates have fallen to about 3.2%. But what is important to note is that this 3.2% rate of unemployment is still 1 percentage point higher than the unemployment rates that we had in 2011-12, which was about 2.2%. So we still have not been able to go back to the unemployment rates of 2.2% of 2011-12, even in 2022-23. That must count as a very important problem that we have at hand with respect to employment generation. But it is important to look at why labor force participations have risen in this particular form and why unemployment rates have fallen in the last few years, even though it remains true that they have not gone back to the levels of 2011-12. Now, if you look closely at the data on this, official data of course, you will see one important feature, and that feature is that much of this increase of labor force participation rate or fall of unemployment rate is because of an increase in the number of people who are self-employed in the economy. Now, official data essentially classify workers into three categories: self-employed workers, regular workers, and casual workers. The share of casual workers has fallen. The share of regular workers has marginally risen, but the share of self-employed people have sharply risen over the last 5 or 6 years. And that is the reason why our labor force participation rates are rising and unemployment rates are falling. Now, some of you may ask, what is wrong in a rise of self-employment rate? Maybe we have a better ecosystem of entrepreneurship in the economy. More people are starting small enterprises in India. Our Prime Minister likes to believe that more and more people are starting pakoda shops in the economy, but that's not necessarily the kind of entrepreneurship that an advancing country should actually desire or aspire for. Let's leave that aside, but let's look at what the data is telling us. This rise of self-employment, where is it coming from? This rise of self-employment, it turns out, is essentially coming from a rise of rural self-employment among women. Now, this graph that you have in front of you, this table, that is in front of you, essentially tells you what are the shares of self-employment in the economy. This particular table will tell you rural plus urban. Now, here you will see that the self-employment among women as a share of all female workers has risen from about 51.9% in 2017-18 to 65.3% in 2022-23. You do not see this appreciable rise in self-employment among men in this same table. But this is rural plus urban. Maybe it is happening in urban also. Is it happening in urban? We must see the next table. This is only for urban areas. Here you will see that the rise of self-employment for women is from 34.7% to 40.4%. Now, this is a rise, of course, but not a very significant rise. And if you look at the same table for self-employment among men, there is hardly any rise at all. It stands almost at the same level at about 39.2 to 39.4%. So it is not in urban areas that you see the most remarkable changes. The most remarkable changes are actually in the rural areas, as you can see from this table. This table tells you that there has been a very significant rise in the share of women who are self-employed in the economy. This rise is from about 57.7% in 2017-18 to about 71% in 2022-23. That's a very, very sharp rise. Do you see that among men? No. In rural areas, self-employed men constitute about 57.8% in 2017-18. They constitute 58.8% in 2022-23. Very minor rise. So essentially, it is self-employment that is responsible for the rise of labor force participation and the fall of unemployment rate, and that is self-employment in rural areas, and that is self-employment among rural women. Now, where would self-employment have risen among women in rural areas? It turns out the same data sources tell us that this rise is actually happening not in sectors outside agriculture in rural areas, but actually in agriculture. More and more women are getting self-employed in agriculture itself. You can see that the share of women employed in agriculture has risen from about 59.7% in 2019 to about 69.1% today. In other words, you see a shift or movement of people from sectors outside agriculture to agriculture. Now, this is not something that you see regularly in countries where per capita incomes are rising. When per capita incomes rise, you usually see the share of workers employed in agriculture falling and the share of workers employed in industry and services rising. But here you are actually seeing the reverse phenomenon, prompting many economists to call it premature deindustrialization, or others calling it as some kind of reverse structural change. In either case, we are speaking about a matter of retrogression in the economy, a structural retrogression in the economy, where jobs are shrinking in sectors outside agriculture, and in agriculture, where incomes are falling, profitability is falling, you have a crowding of people, particularly women, in the last few years. Now that actually shows not prosperity but distress, not vibrancy but losses everywhere. Now this is yet another important problem that we have in the rural areas vis-a-vis unemployment. Now one more point is important. Maybe wages are actually rising, and that might actually show some kind of vibrancy in the rural economy. What is happening to wages? It turns out that wages have not been rising in the economy for quite a while. Rural real wages were rising in India till 2016-17. This graph that is in front of you essentially tells you that rural real wages were rising up to 2016-17, but after 2016-17 they have not risen at all. Nominal wages have risen, but the pressure on inflation has been such that most of the rise in nominal wages, the benefits of rise in nominal wages have been completely finished off, has been completely destroyed, and real wages have largely been constant from 2016-17 onwards in rural areas. Now, in the last 2 years, particularly because so many people have gone back to agriculture, have crowded the agricultural labor markets. You actually also see a fall of real wage rates in rural areas, which is a very, very striking adverse feature in the rural labor market that is unraveling itself, so to say, today in the rural economy of our country. So if you look at what is happening to employment, undoubtedly there is a dearth of good jobs that are being generated in the economy. There is distress everywhere. Incomes are falling. People have lost jobs. Beginning from demonetization and GST reform through the period of COVID, there has been a major loss of jobs in sectors outside agriculture, in urban areas. Enterprises have shut down. Jobs have been lost. Workers have been laid off. And no new jobs are being generated in the economy to any adequate level. As a result, these people have returned to rural areas. They are crowding agriculture. And they are also contributing to a fall of real rural wage rates in the rural labor markets. This is apart from the fact that for a long period of time, incomes in agriculture in real terms have also been falling. This is the status of employment that we see around us in the economy today. As you can see, this is also at enormous variance from what the tall claims that are often being put forward in the media by spokesperson or spokespersons, so to say, of the government, both in the academia and in the media. From employment, let us now come to the question of poverty. The government has recently put out what it calls a fact sheet. It is not even a report, but a fact sheet which contains the results of the consumption expenditure survey that it conducted in 22 and 23, and it essentially tells us, without any corroborating numbers or without even releasing the raw data which were used for those calculations, it is essentially telling us that consumption expenditures in India have risen very rapidly and poverty has been falling rapidly, and we are very close to eliminating poverty from this country. How true are these claims? If you actually consider the last consumption expenditure survey that we had properly and whose data were actually released to the public, it was in 2011-12. That was the last year when in which we had a consumption expenditure survey and which was fully released to the public and economists for analysis. After that, we had a survey in 2017-18, but its results were never released to the public. Now, some interesting data from that survey has come out through a leaked report. Now, that leaked report and analysis surrounding that leaked report essentially tell us that there was actually a rise of poverty by about 5 percentage points in the rural areas of India between 2011-12 and 2017-18. Clearly, that might be the reason why the government refused to release the data publicly. From that point onwards, the government has relied upon either projections from 2011-12, which have been very unscientific, to be frank, or they have been relying on an alternative, which they have called multi-dimensional poverty index. Now, this multi-dimensional poverty index is essentially a composite index. It combines a large number of indicators related to the ownership of assets of the household, the financial institutional linkages of the household, like for example, whether the household owns a bank account, whether the household owns a house which is pakka or kacha in any form. So you bring together all these indicators, you score them in a particular form, and then you rank them and you create some kind of a composite index and compare it over time. Now, this multidimensional poverty index shows a fall after 2015, And the government has claimed that we have brought out X or Y number of people out of poverty during our regime. But what is important to note is that this multidimensional poverty index has very little to do with poverty. Poverty in India has always been measured using a poverty line, which is consumption related in some form. We have considered calories as the foundation for that. There have been committees which have said that we should take proteins and fats also, which is the Rangarajan report, which has never been accepted by the government. So we have a Tendulkar poverty line, which is essentially calorie based, and the Rangarajan poverty line, which is calorie plus protein plus fat. But none of this has been used for the estimation of the so-called poverty under the so-called multidimensional poverty index estimation. In other words, I would not call it a poverty estimate at all. It is just a composite index that tells us something. You can say, as some economists have pointed out, it is an arbitrary measure of deprivation at best. It is not a poverty estimate. Why is it an arbitrary measure of deprivation? Because a household is considered not asset poor if it owns a bicycle or a motorcycle. A household is not considered poor vis-a-vis housing if it has either the roof or the wall or the floor of a house which is pakka. A household is considered or is given a higher score if it owns a bank account, regardless of the fact that bank account may actually be khali or empty. So it is essentially something which is very indirect, which doesn't essentially measure the real status of poverty of individuals, but at best gives you some indirect idea about some indirect estimates related to deprivation, which are assessed based on some arbitrary benchmarks. But the government has been using it because it is useful. It sort of feeds into the very narrative that the government wants to push in the public domain. Now, this is not a poverty estimate. Now, we have a poverty estimate presumably now with the release of the fact sheet in 22-23, but we still do not have the full data. So we still do not have estimates of poverty in 22-23 or 23-24, which we could then compare with what existed in 2011-12 based on a poverty line. Such data, such raw data will probably be released only after the elections are over, for reasons you can very well imagine. But what we have in front of us, whatever data that we have in front of us, particularly in the context of the 2017-18 leaked report, is that poverty in India is likely to have risen, number one. And number two, there is very little that we can gauge from the so-called fact sheet that has been released a few weeks prior to the elections with regard to poverty, because that whole report, if you actually see, doesn't even contain the word poverty anywhere. If the whole report does not speak about poverty anywhere, how can it be any evidence that poverty has declined in India? That will have to wait till a fuller analysis of the data is attempted by scholars after the release of the raw data. That will happen only after the election. So that is unlikely to go in as an input in the campaigns prior to the elections. Now, given that the economy has been performing so poorly, demand has been compressed, very few jobs are being generated, poverty is probably rising, what would a typical government do? A democratically elected government which is answerable to people, which is actually ruling on behalf of the people, is essentially supposed to or expected to step in. Step in with what? Step in with higher expenditures in the economy to generate demand, to generate employment, to reduce poverty through putting more money into the pockets of people, and so on. Now, what has the present government done? Very surprisingly, if you see, the expenditures of the government as a share of the GDP appear to have actually fallen. Economists usually speak about a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. In other words, when the economy is doing badly, demand is low, the government comes in with higher levels of expenditure, higher levels of investment, and pump primes the economy by increasing demand, by putting money into the pockets of people, so to say. That is called a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It goes against the trend of economic growth. When the economic growth falls, you spend more. That's what usually governments have done across the world, including during the time of the pandemic. But in India, if you see, this has not happened. We actually have a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. In other words, when economic growth has been falling, you have concurrently reduced your expenditure to GDP ratios. This graph that is in front of you shows you those numbers, that is of the expenditure GDP ratios in the economy. If you see closely, you will see that the expenditure GDP ratios of the government have actually fallen from about 16% in about 2009-10 or 10-11 to about 12.3% in 2018-19. And then from there it has risen a little bit because of COVID, but after that rise during COVID, it is falling again. So basically, till COVID, you simply did not have a rise of expenditures to counter falling demand, falling growth, falling employment, etc. You actually had expenditures following the same trend that is coming down. So the government has been doing nothing to counter the depressing tendencies in the economy. That is one important feature. But why has this been the case? This has been the case because A, the government has not been collecting adequate amount of revenues in the form of tax or non-tax revenues. Now I will show you a graph which essentially will give you the tax to GDP ratios in the economy. You will see that the tax to GDP ratio of the union government, as you can see from the bottom line in this graph, has been constant for a substantial period of time in the last decade or more at about 10.1 to 10.3%. There has been no rise in the tax to GDP ratios at all in the Indian economy over the past decade. One important reason, as we have discussed already, is the sharp reduction in corporate tax rates, which led to the government foregoing close to 1.5 lakh crore rupees every year in the form of tax revenues. And there has been no other revenue source which has compensated for that sharp fall of revenue inflows in the government, which essentially means that the government has no tax revenues that are coming in increasingly to finance a higher expenditure to GDP ratio in the economy. The government has been sitting idle, so to say. This is to be seen along with the fact that the borrowings of the government have also not risen to compensate for the tax GDP ratios not rising, allowing the government to spend more in the economy. The government has been hell-bent on a policy of fiscal austerity based on an ideology of fiscal conservatism, whereby fiscal deficits have to be kept in check in order to keep foreign capital happy, in order to keep foreign investors happy, in order to ensure their belief that the Indian economy is a secure destination for their speculative hot money flows. We have kept our fiscal deficits in check, which essentially meant that we have neither collected enough tax revenues to finance higher expenditures, nor have we increased borrowings to allow us a larger fiscal space to spend in the economy. This is the reason why I said for most of the last decade, when the economy was doing badly, the government probably was not doing anything at all to counter it. It was probably sitting idle. Finally, there is one claim that you will see everywhere, which is that digital transactions in the Indian economy are rising or expanding very rapidly, and that increasing trend towards digitalization of transactions is a very important sign of success in the government policies. What is the reality in this whole claim related to digitalization of payment systems? This is what we will see in the next 2 or 3 slides. I will first mention that there is a very important difference when you analyze such things between what is volume and what is value. Volume is related to the number of transactions that happens digitally, but value is related to the total amount that is transacted such. If you pay 10 rupees at a coffee shop through Google Pay or Paytm or any such mode, it is one transaction. You go to the next shop and buy a packet of biscuits for 10 rupees, you again do this transaction, that is a second transaction. All these are volumes of transactions. We do a lot of this today. We don't pay small amounts of money, 10 rupees, 20 rupees, 50 rupees, 100 rupees to either a tea shop or a coffee shop or a taxi driver or an auto driver through cash at all. We do a lot of these things digitally, primarily because many of us do not keep enough change with us, and we don't anymore like to keep coins and all with us in our pockets. So a lot of these transactions are done digitally, which essentially shows that volumes of transaction are rising rapidly, which is true. But that does not tell us anything about rising efficiency of monetary transactions in the economy. For that, values of transactions must also rise as rapidly as volumes. Has that happened? This graph in front of you tells you that while the volume of transactions have risen very rapidly, that is not the case for value of transactions. The value of transactions have been rising very, very slowly. Very, very slowly compared to the volume of transactions. That is, I divide the value of transactions with the volume, and I find out how much value is transacted per volume of transaction. If I consider that, which is what you see in the graph in front of you, you will see a very sharp reduction in the average value of one transaction. It has fallen from about 1,55,000 rupees per transaction in 2015-16 to just about 18,000 rupees per transaction in 2022-23. This is because it is not in the high value transactions that we are seeing digitalization, but in very small value but high volume number of transactions that we see growth. That does not tell us anything about increasing efficiency in the economy, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to buttress this fact with one more data point, which is much discussed in India, particularly in the context of demonetization, which is the cash to GDP ratio in the Indian economy. When you had demonetization, we had a cash to GDP ratio of 12.1%. Now that was considered very high according to the spokespersons of the government, and it was often cited as one reason for demonetization. Yes, in the year of demonetization, which is to 2016-17, you had a fall of the cash to GDP ratio from 12.1% to 8.7%. Yes, but then there was remonetization in the economy. More number of notes were printed, including the notorious, by now demised rupees 2000 note. From then onwards, you have had a constant rise of the cash to GDP ratio in the economy. You see this value rising from 8.7% to up to 14.4% in 2020-21, which is very high. In other words, in 2020-21, we had a cash to GDP ratio higher than in 2015-16. And from then onwards, we have seen a small fall. We are now at 12.5% in terms of our cash to GDP ratio. But most importantly, it is still higher than the cash to GDP ratio that existed prior to demonetization. So is it really a success? Is the whole increase of volumes of digital transactions a true sign of increasing efficiency in monetary transactions? It doesn't look like it if we look at the value of transactions. That has not risen as rapidly as volumes. And our cash to GDP ratio is stubbornly high even today. So what comes out of all this discussion? It turns out that much of the tall claims made by the government or the spokespersons of the government or those who support the government's claims are actually exaggerations. We have seen that by looking at the different indicators related to economic growth. We have seen GVA growth rates, GDP growth rates. We have seen investment rate, savings rate, exports, bank credit growth, capacity utilization in manufacturing. How is agriculture doing? How is industry doing? If you look at all these indicators that we examined, the sum total of all that shows that the Indian economy has not just been not growing adequately in the last decade, but many of the indicators associated with economic growth have actually been thoroughly depressed from about 2011-12 onwards. And the last 10 years from 2014 onwards, if you look at it, there is nothing that has happened. The government of this period has done pretty little to ameliorate this crisis in the economy, to repair this crisis in the economy. Our economy went through regular shocks during this period. The completely irrational demonetization, which threw a large number of people out of their jobs, shutting down enterprises, destroying supply chains, and then followed by the GST reform, which led to enormous formalization of the informal sector, leading to the capture of the formal sector of much of the informal sector markets, which increased the dispossession levels in the informal sector, which again led to a loss of a large number of jobs. By 2019-20, even before COVID, you were in a bad shape. Your growth rates are fallen to about 3 to 4% by then. Then COVID came. It made a bad situation worse. You had your growth rates plummeting to negative levels. But then from there, you are supposed to be recovering. Many economies of the world, through very important and significant counter-cyclical fiscal policies, have led their economies out of the plunge that they took during COVID. They are now growing rapidly. But if you look at India, you have just come back to your old growth rates. You are not on any accelerated growth path in any form in the period that has that you have after COVID, and you do not seem to be in any high growth path at present as well. The government, as I said, has done very little. Its fiscal policy has been pro-cyclical, more to say, than counter-cyclical. If you look at different indicators of well-being of people in terms of employment, poverty, and so on, the situation again appears to be one of distress and not of either prosperity or vibrancy in the economy. And this is the sum total of all the indicators that you have in front of you from official sources themselves. This is the reality that we have. It is important that we need to separate the unreasonable, irrational, exaggerated claims made by a section of people or the media and sort of compare them, contrast them, and to assess with what we have as robust assessments of the economy using well collected data, including from official sources. If you employ such an analytical framework, what you see is many of the tall claims that the government makes are based on poor data, badly collected data, badly put together data, badly analyzed data. And if you look at those data points which are robustly collected, which are universally respected in terms of their sampling method, method of collection, analysis, and so on, most indicators that we have seen in this presentation show a very poor state in terms of their growth or development in the last 10 years. This is the reality of the Indian economy that you have in front of you. And this is the reality that people must bear in their mind when they go to the polling booths to cast their votes in this great democracy of the world. Thank you.